equity lens in disaster and climate risk management. So I would like to invite the speakers to join her on the spotlight.
Thank you so much, Sahar. So it's wonderful to be here with you to think about issues of equity in particular, and to foreground the experience, the stories, the needs, and the futures of people who are disproportionately impacted by emergency and disasters and risks. So I am joined by 4 brilliant women, and I'm very delighted to be able to introduce you all, and then to really invite your thoughts. So first of all, we have Lilia Yumagulova, who's a resilience specialist and also the program director of a very exciting project focusing on youth called Preparing Our Home. We have Robin Cox, who's a professor and director of the Resilience by Design Lab at Royal Roads University. We have Katia Tynan, who's the manager of resilience in DRR in the city of Vancouver. And we have Johanna Wagstaffe, who's a journalist, meteorologist, seismologist, working with the CBC. So how I would like to open this up is to really turn the mic over to you and to invite you to offer us some opening remarks about how equity lands in the worlds and the work that you do. And I know that a few of you have slides to share. So I wanted to ask Lily if you would be willing to open up by offering us your opening comments.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you so much, Sahar and Shane, for having us here today. So when we talk about whole of society approach, the first thing we really need to do is actually focus on whole of society. The current Canadian risk management and DRR system is really designed around middle-class, property-owning, insured Canadians. And this is not the reality for many. So when we think about disaster response, again, we need to think about actual realities and hard data. So one of the things is that we think about government playing a prominent role, but as some of the data shows, it's actually family members and neighbors and friends that come to help first and foremost. When we think about preparedness kits and when with the constant messaging, be ready for 72 hours, when 53% of surveyed Canadians are $200 away from insolvency, it's really hard to find that $200 to be prepared. When we think about First Nation communities, and I want to thank Chief Patrick for the exceptional work that he's done in this realm in terms of preparing the communities, we need to think about, again, about hard data and evidence. So First Nation communities in Canada are 33 times more likely to be evacuated due to wildfire, 18 times more likely to be evacuated due to any disaster, and fire fatalities on reserves at 10 times higher. So when we ask that hard question, what would disaster risk reduction look like through an equity lens, we do need to think about whole society and not just middle-class insured Canadians. We also need to think about, we are more likely to protect things that really matter to us. So when we talk about data, it's really important to also talk about values. So what do we value? And this is a brilliant example that I wanted to highlight from Matagami First Nation and Lillooet Nation in British Columbia, which focuses on Indigenous value mapping. So as part of the critical infrastructure assessment, actually mapping the trap lines, mapping the berry patches, mapping the canoe routes, and so on and so forth. So not just mapping the things that Public Safety Canada tells us are important for critical infrastructure, but those vital pieces that keep communities alive. And the third message that I would like to highlight today is voice. So really important when you are having these discussions in your organizations, in your consulting firms, in your government, who is at the table? Whose voice is missing? And when we talk about voice, it's also important to talk about language. So using the right language to describe these groups. Are they equity seeking or are they equity denied, for example? And even this word resilience, I wanted to highlight a quote from two matriarchs. It's a book chapter that's coming out Rosalita Whitehair, a Dane matriarch, and a Blackfoot matriarch. And this is what it says. We need to use caution when using the word resilience to describe social responses in a system that perpetuates inequities and injustice for those who face some of the highest climate risks on Turtle Island. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Lily. So I would love to invite Katia, you to offer your opening remarks and build on these wonderful insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just give me a moment to get my slides up for you.
No problem.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Katia Tynan. I wrote an article in the DRR report with the incomparable Aphrodite Boukadis, who is also on the call today. And I'm here to talk about the role of social infrastructure in disaster and climate risk and resilience. So for those of you unfamiliar with this term, social infrastructure refers to places, so buildings and gathering spaces, as well as programs and services, and then finally people, so the interconnected networks between people and relationships that people have established within community that all contribute to community well-being. And the reason why these places are important is day to day, they offer this crucial role in developing kind of thriving communities. So social infrastructure looks specifically at how can everybody in a community thrive. So again, taking that kind of equity-centered approach and looking at how they can meet basic human needs, often human needs that government services have ignored, or where governments have actually both intentionally and unintentionally excluded people from services. They also offer this crucial role in kind of helping people realize their full potential. So not just those basic needs, but what are those additional needs that people have to be able to thrive? So they take kind of this, Lily spoke to this, but a kind of values and relational approach, looking at how do we adjust and change programs and services and offerings over time to specifically meet this changing society that we live in. And then finally, last but not least, these organizations also play this critical role in fostering a sense of belonging and well-being. So in Vancouver's context, to think about the relationship people have with their neighbors and their community, we know that 1 in 4 residents in Vancouver feels isolated, and we know that 46% of people in Vancouver report not having a strong sense of belonging. So these organizations offer a crucial role in kind of fostering those connections and that social cohesion that we're looking for. And so what does this mean for disaster and climate risk and resilience? We also know that when there are disasters, people go to the places they trust, to the services that they trust, and ultimately to the other people in their network that they trust for support during these sorts of events. So social infrastructure as trusted spaces within community, whether they want to or not, end up playing this really critical role during disasters, especially because they're placing this lens of what do people need and what do the people who are most left out need during these sorts of, during day-to-day and then also during disasters. They're also really flexible and adaptable, so they come up with really innovative grassroots solutions far before government usually steps in to provide services during emergencies and disasters. And then finally, they're also really full of irreplaceable knowledge and skills and networks and assets. So many of these groups and organizations have deep knowledge, not just of the people in their community, but also the physical places, the lands, the waters, the buildings, the infrastructure. And they really are able to focus not just on kind of this idea of what's in your emergency kit, but also who is in your kit. So who are the people that we need to rely on and who need to rely on us during emergencies, and how do we foster deeper connections and well-being with them day to day? And then how do we leverage those during emergencies and crises? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Katia. So we're building a basket of equity-informed lenses, tools, and language. So Robin, I'd like to pass the basket to you next and to invite you to offer some opening thoughts.
Thanks so much, Maya, and Shane and Sahar for inviting us on this great panel. Yeah, well, it's very easy to build on what both Lily and Katia have said. You know, this report opens the door for discussion and action to improve resilience. And I totally agree with you, Lily. We need to understand what we mean by that term and understand how some of the terms, many of the terms that we use, have inequality baked into them. But I will say that this report, much of this report, describes things that we already knew and know, which is we have known for many, many years, for decades, based on great research here in Canada and internationally, that disasters do not, disasters are not equally experienced by various populations, that the impacts are inequitably distributed across populations, and that we need to take action. So one of it is about centering climate just and disaster risk aware policies and strategies in our governments, and that includes the provincial government. So we really need to look at how climate justice is baked into policies and strategies, understanding that climate justice is intrinsically connected to Indigenous justice. So we need to be baking that in. How do we do that? One way I think we do it is by de-siloing government departments and ministries and policies. We still have a lot of siloing going on, and disaster risk reduction and climate action, climate justice need to be much more integrally connected so that we're informing each other and learning from a wealth of research in the disaster area and on the climate side. That also requires that we build capacity in the public sector. There is, yes, there are ministries such as agencies like Emergency Management BC and the Climate Action Secretariat, but we need a public sector across the board that is climate aware, that understands climate justice and bakes that into all the decisions they make. And that, I think, is going to require mandated education and training around climate and disasters so that everyone, whether they're in transport, forestry, agriculture, whatever, understands enough about climate and how it impacts people, understands enough about disasters and how they impact various populations so that they can be making decisions and policies that reflect that. What does that require? That also requires meaningful and inclusive engagement, and that other words that we toss around and rarely actualize. So I think really understanding who are the populations and subpopulations we need to be bringing in, how do we support their engagement, not just assume that they can engage because they may or may not have the capacity to do that, funding, time, etc., to inform and co-design these policies and strategies. And finally, and we'll talk more about this later, I know, that also is going to require what a couple of folks have already spoken to, Chief Mitchell and I think Lily, which is that we need good data to do this, and we need data that is disaggregated so we understand and can identify who is going to be most vulnerable, who are affected by these risks, climate risks, disaster risks, and how do we engage those folks in designing and drawing on their intelligence and wisdom and pre-existing resilience and work with them to reduce their vulnerability. So I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin, so much, and for putting more things in our basket. And indeed, we're going to be pulling things back out. But Johanna, the basket coming over to you. We would love to hear your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to continue to learn and collaborate with all of you. So in putting together my media role for the report, I had the opportunity to talk to many colleagues, both with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and with colleagues across various news platforms and news publication services. And it was so eye-opening to see how many challenges and gaps that we all share. And obviously just listening so far, it's obvious the role that media plays as a vehicle to get information and inspiration out to our communities. And that means all of our communities, especially our most vulnerable and at-risk communities. And I think that has been a challenge for media. First of all, is identifying those stories and the people who can tell those stories from those communities. I know newsrooms across the province have been taking steps to make sure that's now part of our journalistic standards and practice, that our stories are representative of all communities, especially our most vulnerable. But it's also figuring out how to deliver those stories in a changing landscape. And I think that's something that all media is really struggling with and looking for answers and experimenting with right now. We already have a challenge getting information to our most vulnerable people. And now that the way that we consume news is changing so dramatically, and we're not on even footing there, we haven't figured it out, that landscape continues to change. It's taking that responsibility to make sure we are experimenting and seeing what is working when it comes to getting that information out. And it's not just information and inspiration, it's also a two-way conversation with the media. So it's making sure we're finding those points that we can hear back from our most vulnerable. And I was really inspired by Chief Mitchell's opening remarks, talking about how important positivity is. And I've really seen that shift in our own newsroom. And I know that is something that all newsrooms across the province are also seeing. You know, after the 2017 historic wildfire season, for the first time in our newsroom, we saw that shift from the public demanding that the conversation include more science, include more climate change, more background. And then it was after the relentless disasters that British Columbia has faced over the past year and a half, that demand from the audience shifted again, and they wanted to know what could be done. And the doom and gloom I'm seeing from our newsroom is starting to shift after such a relentless year and a half. The audience, which is our public, the people of British Columbia, want to know what can be done, and they want to see it in a different lens. And so I think we're now trying to figure out, through working with all of you, what the best way to tell those stories of resilience and to inspire more resilience, especially in our most vulnerable community. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. So we have already a rich and heavy basket that we'll, as I said, draw from. You know, one of the things in our work on equity and foregrounding issues of equity is really sometimes just to ground and you know, work really concretely with these very big, overwhelming sometimes, and sometimes very theoretical issues. So I wanted to just ask if we could ground in something that we, in some of the events that we talked about, including on Friday, but particularly just to ask if you could talk to us a little bit about what were some of the experiences and forms of engagement that you had with the heat dome in 2021, to try and just ground us in the realities of equity issues. And Katia, I know that you've done a lot of thinking and work around this, and I wondered if we could go to you first.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, so Vancouver, to be clear, has had a heat response plan for just about a decade now. I think the challenge that we saw during the heat dome is, or one of the challenges we saw during the heat dome in 2021, is that plan was fairly generic and really kind of focused primarily on sort of middle class, mobile folks. And so after the heat dome, we ended up sort of doing some engagement with people who are disproportionately impacted by that event. So we met with seniors, we met with persons with disabilities, we met with drug users in the downtown east side, a range of other communities to really understand what do they need to feel safe and supported during future heat events, and how do we make sure we get those things to them in the way that they need them. So what we heard back from those groups actually fundamentally transformed our heat response plan plan. And we got to work over the following months with our social infrastructure partners, trying to identify what are the actions that they are actually best suited to take on. So we knew that neighborhood houses, for example, had been doing wellness checks on isolated seniors all through the pandemic. And so they were able to transform those wellness checks to meet the needs of people during heat as well. They have those trusting relationships, they know where people live, and we were able to sort of look at all of these actions that were identified by communities affected, and then we were able to work with those partners to actually deliver on those. Some of the other actions that came out of it were really interesting, where folks were really calling for cooling in place. So lots of folks spoke to us and said, listen, I actually physically cannot leave my building during a heat event. So having cooling centers, centralized cooling centers in the city is not actually helpful for me. There were other folks who said, I can't afford transit to get to those centers. There were other folks who said, I don't feel safe there because I'm an undocumented migrant. So looking at what are the needs of the people who are disproportionately impacted and how do we make sure we deliver those services, and listening to them about what they needed totally transformed a lot of our heat planning. And I think we noticed those changes this summer in terms of like hearing from the ground that people did feel more safe and supported. We had managed to get cool kits out the door again through our social infrastructure partners, so that people could be cool in their homes. We translated materials that hadn't been translated in the past. All these ranges of actions that hadn't been done for about 10 years came out of just asking people that question and then committing to do the things that they actually said that they needed.
Thank you so much. And it is so profound and so key to our equity work to just find out what people need where they are. Lily, this is a piece of work that you've engaged with a lot as well, and I wanted to invite your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Maya. And just to build on what Katia done, and I just want to uplift in this space all the Climate Action Secretariat, and I believe Emma is on the call. She was leading this work with our consulting team at the province. So I just wanted to talk about the lived experience report. So building on what Katia said, basically, some of the solutions that we provide, like the centralized cooling centers, if you are an 80 kilometers bus ride away from a cooling center as a rural resident, there is no way you will get there. If you're a homeless person whose all of your belongings are in the cart and carts are not allowed or pets are not allowed, you're not going to get there. So what we did a very similar work only provincially. And one of the things that really came out of this work is that there is a lot of attention happening to these issues in urban locations, but we are virtually not exploring this in the rural locations, right? So, and the rural homelessness and rural drug addictions and, like substance use and all of that, it looks really different. So one of the participants, I'll just share a couple of stories. One of the participants, insecurely housed, Meredith, she goes by Meredith. She's a transgender woman who is insecurely housed, and she's severely diabetic. So she didn't get any information about heat impacts on her as a diabetic person, which we know are severe. And what she said, I don't want special treatment. I want equal treatment. And to me, I think this really kind of gets to the core of what needs to be provided. Another mom of four, single mom of four, she was living in a yurt at the time. Just in transition from one location to another, insecurely housed. She has 4 children. So the heat dome event came. She didn't even know there was a heat dome event. She was 8 months pregnant. She just felt severely unwell. And the unfortunate reality in this location, in the Kootenays where we were doing this work, right after the heat dome came a massive fire with all the smoke and heat. And she didn't have any gas in her car to get out during evacuation. So she was running, literally 8 months pregnant, running across the hill, like in the hills in the forested area where she lives, trying to get $20 so she could drive out and have something to fill her car with. So that's one of the things that really came out. Like, we need to also understand this heat dome event in the scope of multiple events that these people experience. So after the heat dome came the fires, the weeks and weeks of smoke, which was followed by the atmospheric river events and washouts and landslides. So when we talk about resilience, it's eroded event after event after event. So I think these are some of the really important things to keep in mind when thinking about what people are experiencing. And just one more thing, since Johanna is here and she spoke about communication, we engaged with over 100 people for this project. And one of the really strong things that came out is empathy-based communication. So literally explaining that this person on the street, they don't have an ability to fill up their water bottle, right? People felt like they were driven away from the shade areas and so on and so forth. So how do we build empathy within the reporting, really focusing on these lived realities?
Thank you so very, very much. So I wonder if Robin, you had anything else you wanted to contextualize about this particular heat event. And you're
Well,
not obliged to.
yeah, I mean, there's so much that can be said, and the research has been great identifying how that played out. I think one of the things that I want to build on is, and I think Katia provided an example of how this can happen. I'm sure that there were glitches there in terms of translating these events and these experiences into policy and policy changes quickly. And as Lilia said, these events are happening more quickly, more frequently, and co-occurring. So we often are planning for one thing, not recognizing that you have to be planning for multiple things at the same time. So one of the things that wasn't mentioned, so to support that and to really understand that, again, this comes back to, it's not just about data, et cetera, and research, but understanding that these different populations, renters would have been another one who have no control over whether they're living in a place that has cooling options. But another element of this also is systems. We have systems in place, and I'll speak specifically to the emergency health system during the heat dome, but also subsequent to that, that is stretched to the max and beyond the max, that they barely have capacity and are, I've got a colleague who works in emergency health, and, they barely have the capacity at times to respond to normal events right now in terms of staffing levels, ambulance, et cetera. And so we have to be looking at systems and how we have to bolster those systems in this space and bolster them again with this equity lens. So they're bringing in empathy, they're addressing the specific needs of underserved, under or unrepresented populations in the decision-making process. So I would just add that in. There's lots more I could say, but I think, this idea that we have research, we still need more research, but it's pointless to have that research if it's not translated into policy and practice. And very often it is not, or it's so slow that we're having to create new research because the situation has changed. So that's what I would add. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin, so much. And Johanna, I don't know if anything comes to mind that you really want to say about reporting on or studying the heat dome, but you're welcome to offer any thoughts you might have.
Yeah, thank you. Just going back to Lily's point of empathy, I'm glad you made that one, because telling the stories after the fact is much easier than before. And I think the media learned a lot of lessons as well out of that heat dome. I think people their science literacy is building, and also their demand for transparency. So after an event like this, it was interesting to see again our audiences wanting more information about why our most vulnerable communities were hit the hardest, and wanting to know the studies that they wanted to see the heat maps showing our most at-risk communities with the temperatures hotter than the surrounding areas. The challenge for us, I think, in this particular event, it was positive to really see how much more time, all of our producers and news directors gave for quality and quantity of reporting before this event. But I think our challenge is still finding ways to get that empathy out before an event hits. And, you can say, check on your neighbors, but at the end of the day, that didn't cut it. So I think we have to figure out how to get into the communities and share that information before the event happens.
Thank you so much. And I think these are just such important events to reflect on, because we really can change how we're thinking and working going forward. The next question I wanted to move to, and it's already coming through, and Robin, you've mentioned these words a lot, evidence and data and so on. But I wanted to just turn to this idea of knowledge building, of evidence being robust, and of reliable data that reflects an equity perspective. And so I wanted to ask you if you could share your thoughts on the importance of data, of information, of knowledge building, and particularly to think about kind of when we use an equity lens, what are some of the existing gaps in our data, but our processes as well? And what kind of knowledge do we need to have to strengthen our responses in an equity informed way and empower people? And so, Lilia, I wanted to ask if you could speak to this issue first.
Thank you. Yes, Maya. I think we already mentioned some of the things. So disaggregated data, it's crucial. If we are talking about whole of society approach, let's actually look at the whole of society spectrum, right? So that's really critical. But there is a lot more to data than just data. So really, especially in the context of Indigenous communities, vulnerable communities, communities of color, single mothers, people on social assistance, so on and so forth, people with substance use and addictions, there is a big question of trust. Because historically, the way research has been done, you go in, you harvest, you leave, and nobody ever hears about you again. So it's really important to put the evidence and data in the context of reciprocity. What relationship are we building through this data process? What benefits will there be for me personally, right? Like as a participant, for example, or my social group that I represent. So I think that question of relationships, reciprocity, that's what's really important to go alongside the data. And I also really, I disagree with Robin. I don't think we need more research. I think we have research coming out of our ears. Like, I think we have so much research and so much knowledge and so much evidence base. It's just getting it in the right spaces for action. Like, I honestly think we are running out of time for research, but there is still time for action if we start today or if we started yesterday. And I think, as Chief Patrick said, hope is a renewable resource. So the more we act, the more hopeful we'll become. And I think that's a really important point.
Thank you so much, Lily. I'd like actually to go next to you, Robin, and just ask for your thoughts on data, evidence, and so on.
Sure. I just want to respond to Lily's comment. I actually, and maybe I wasn't clear, I actually think I said the opposite, which is I also agree that we have a lot of research. I think there's always room for research and that will evolve. But as I said at the beginning, we know what needs to happen. We're super clear on that. You can go back decades of research in disaster management. You can go back decades in research around social health and health and wellness. We understand what we need to do. So the challenge is not that, it's actually doing it. And doing it in the ways that Lily and Katia and we've all been describing, doing it with that social justice, that social equity lens, using the data. So we don't have all the data because we haven't disaggregated the data. So figuring that out, but again, de-siloing. So we've got a lot of information in the health, on the health side, the social determinants of health, translate that into this work. We know that we need to make visible community-driven understanding of their needs, their challenges, and their strengths. So if we don't have that information, this doesn't have to be formal academic whatever research, which takes forever to do and forever to translate. Community engaged research, where the community is researching itself and saying, this is what we need, this is what we have, this is what we want to do, here's our vision, here's our values. We need to treat data in ways that promote self-determination. And this builds, I think, on what Lee was saying about reciprocity and relationships. So, using data is only helpful if it's also building on things that the community and communities and populations want. And so I think that kind of approach, that sort of engaged approach to data, that disaggregated approach to data, that community engaged approach to whatever research is happening or whatever work is happening with the research findings, so that we start moving the dial forward and stop talking about it as though we're moving forward, but actually moving it forward. And there are some great examples of that happening, but nowhere near enough. And again, I'll just finish off by saying that I think, and this is not to dump on the provincial government, BC is one of the first, or I think the only provincial government that has created open data. But nonetheless, we need to be working to get public sector, whether it's municipal, provincial, federal, to understand this and to be mandated to do this, because without, at that level, it needs to be driven from the community, but also needs to be driven from the top, in the sense that we need to change the way we create policies. We need to change the way, the time lag between policy and changes in regulations, et cetera. Otherwise, as Lily said, we're running out of time, and we don't have time to waste in terms of coming up with ways of ensuring equitable data, data that is useful, and data that is used to support self-determination and the rights of various populations. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Robin. And I just want to invite people to also look at the chat box, because there's really wonderful dialogue and examples unfolding there. Katia, over to you.
Thanks, Maya, and just wholeheartedly agree with everything that's been said on this topic so far. I'll just describe sort of how we have been working with data, and specifically around heat this last year. So I think there's two kind of components to this for us. And one is really recognizing that we in government often prioritize kind of quote unquote content experts in this work, and we need to start focusing on context experts. So working with people with lived expertise that oftentimes people in positions of power in government don't have, to really focus on what is the context, the unique context they're living in, and how do the policies that we make, the plans that we make actually apply to their lives. And so I think what we've did in our heat work around working with those communities and trying to understand their stories from the heat dome really enabled us to have a pretty transformative process around our extreme heat planning. And Johanna spoke to this earlier, the criticality of storytelling. And I think I've learned from amazing colleagues at the City of Vancouver who often say the phrase, stories are data, and we don't always think of them that way. And so bringing out those stories and finding a way to kind of turn our data into also like knowledge and wisdom is the trajectory that we need to go on with some of this data. And what we did during the heat dome, in addition to kind of gathering these stories, and Lily, you spoke to this idea of kind of extraction of knowledge, we also shared the data that we had as a city with our community partners and said, here's actually what we know and what we had. We wanted to make that available to them so that they could actually use that for their own storytelling, use that for their work and the work that they were doing. And then from there, we also asked them to help us validate the information and the data that we had. So an example of this is we were lucky to work with Vancouver Coastal Health and pull some data on where emergency room visits during the heat dome were originating from within the city. And it showed these hotspots in certain neighborhoods. And when we spoke with our community partners, they were really immediately able to say, well, there's actually 2 buildings that exclusively house seniors and isolated seniors that are in this pocket right here that is a hotspot in the city. So we were able to kind of validate and make meaning out of this otherwise pretty generic data that we had by communicating and sharing with our partners the information we had, and then getting a lot more back as a result out of it. And then they were able to take that same data and use it to create their own plans and to do their own work. So that idea of making sure that we're actually just sharing the knowledge that we have and recognizing the interconnectedness between the content expertise and the context expertise, you can't have one without the other, was really important to the way that we changed our plans.
Thank you very much. These are great examples as research, as action. Johanna, over to you.
Just, building on Katia, what you were saying about needing to understand how. individuals are not only impacted by the event, but by programs in place. I think that's something that we need to do more of in media, and something that we're talking more about, and was a big part of sort of the takeaway for me working through this this article, was telling stories of resilient communities, especially communities who have seen success. And we don't do a lot of that because I think, you know, we'll need more collaboration from the science front, but it's and help, I think, in making sure, and trust also, making sure that you know, the science side doesn't feel like we're going to sensationalize this sort of preemptive storytelling, but it's finding our most at-risk communities and targeting basically the stakeholders who can put these programs in place. So, you know, for example, finding low-income housing during the heat dome that did use available programs to put a heat pump into that building. And so, you know, finding the science to back up the stories from that building that maybe didn't hit the temperatures that other surrounding buildings who didn't have these programs put in place. And so it's sharing stories of resilience, and without saying this entire building would have met the same fate as another building. So it's finding that balance, and it's the type of storytelling we're not doing a lot right now. So I think it's building those partnerships and trust with scientists and media to try and get those stories out ahead of time to inspire more stakeholders to see what a difference they can make.
Thank you so much. So there is so much that you could say. We have about 5 minutes left in this presentation. What I'd like to do is just ask a final question, and then we'll see where we're at with time. But to just ask, as we come to the end of laying our thinking around equity, if there are any ideas or suggestions you have about how we can build more resilient society. So not just build back or build back better, you know, replace or redo or go back into the systems that are deeply inequitable and unsustainable. But actually, what do we need to do next to build more equitable, sustainable, resilient societies in your minds? So I'm just going to open it up to the floor. I don't know, Robin, I'll ask if you have a thought first, but where do we need to really go next?
It's a big question. And, you know, in many ways, what we've already said, I think, is part of that answer, which is, I think, you know, we need, it's like a shift needs to happen in the value proposition of what we value in society. And that requires all of what we've talked about, to center a climate just, to center an intersectional lens on all that we do, and to really assess, you know, what we believe is important. And I think, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, that, you know, all flaws about how, you know, things unfolded, but, you know, there was a sense that we were doing that, but that was quickly lost. So I think, you know, as somebody who works in an educational institution, I think one of the avenues for doing that is education and training from K to 12 up, and really bringing in, and, you know, some of this is happening, but nowhere near enough around centering this kind of justice and equity lens in education and training, centering climate literacy in education and training. And that includes bringing disaster management, as I said earlier, more closely aligned with climate adaptation, to really start, you know, and most of the policies say this, but we actually need to do this and enhance that. And then we need to resource that happening. And that includes resourcing, yes, other layers of government like municipal governments, but resourcing people in their neighborhoods, in their communities, rural, urban, and otherwise, you know, resourcing them so that they can do some of this analysis and planning themselves, and that whatever emerges from that is sustained, because we have this sort of short-term funding situation where, you know, one thing gets funded and then another thing gets funded and another. People need to be able to understand what the issues are for themselves, understand what the options are for improving resilience, whether that's infrastructure, personal, otherwise, or using another word altogether, and then be supported in doing that, and doing that in a collaborative way across different groups, et cetera, so that we really are building a whole of society rather than just pockets of resilience, privileged or otherwise.
Thank you so much. Johanna, can I go to you next? What are your recommendations?
I mean, already just this panel has been so insightful. And I think that continually working on the idea of positive storytelling is going to be key moving forward, and building that, again, that relationship between media and the experts and the science to find the storytelling in the numbers and in the data, and having the science and the data help direct where we can best tell those inclusive stories from our most vulnerable communities. But we've seen the shift, especially, I'm glad you brought that up, Robin, after such a tough past few years. There was a moment when our audiences didn't want to hear anything about anything. It was no stories at all about anything doom and gloom after the past few years. But now I really am seeing that shift, that our communities want to hear about what's working. They want to hear about what they can do, and they want to hear about the fact that climate change is bringing out these inequalities that I don't think most people had really thought about until, these relentless disasters. So positive storytelling, I think, is going to be key, and that means more of this great collaboration moving forward.
Thank you so much. Katia, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we can build a better world. What should we do next?
So I think for me, in terms of that build back better concept, we really need to focus not just on human needs, but inherent human rights and dignity for all people in our community. And something that I reflect on quite often is those who define risk also determine the solutions for that risk. And so if we're not actually working with equity denied communities on how to define that risk, how to define recovery for what those communities want to see happen, then we're ultimately going to keep coming up with the same solutions and work within the same systems that actually created the risk in the first place. So we need to actually kind of shift and transform the way that we work with and see those communities as people who have inherent rights to kind of live with safe and affordable housing, with land and rights titles, with access to culturally appropriate food and clean water and clean air and all of these things. And then I also think a big part of that is actually focusing on relationships and accountability to those relationships. And this is something that I think we're trying to work on a lot, is building relationships with those communities and making sure that we actually see ourselves as accountable to them and responsive to them. And then the last thing I'll mention around here, I think when we think about this idea of build back better, and I've heard this theme come out from Chief Patrick as well as multiple people so far, is we also need to work towards having hope in these circumstances. And one of the ways that I think we can do that is actually working with artists and creative sector practitioners, and working with them in how we engage with communities so that we can build kind of new narratives, new imagination about what our communities could actually be like if we were to kind of engage in this transformative change. So making sure that we're not just focused on the doom and gloom and kind of solution side of this, but we're also thinking about all the possibility that we have at our feet in this work.
Thank you so much. And Lily, I'm going to give you the final word on this panel, and it's perfect, including because you work with youth so much, and intergenerational climate justice is really important. So over to you. What do we need to focus on next?
So first of all, on the art point, Katia, I think we don't need $5 million chandeliers under the bridges. I think we can let go of that. So I think there are some stories there that really can be better. I think listening to this panel and just working in this space, I think there is this tension between the enormous urgency and the daunting task and the fear and everything that keeps you awake at night. And then working in the space of equity, you really have to move at the pace of trust. That takes time, relationship, reciprocity, investment of multiple ways, emotional investment. So I think combining those two is the path forward. And then the other thing I wanted to, like this build back better thing, when you look at Sendai carefully, in the priority number 4, build back better, it says not only build back better by the same people that define the risk and define the systems. No, it says put women and peoples with disabilities in the spaces of leadership. And are we doing that? So that's what I want to leave you with. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much. So I think that we have a rich and beautiful basket